Welcome back everyone. So this is our final video that covers our Chapter 1 Intro to Biology from our OpenStax textbook. Alright, so far we've covered introductory to biology. We've looked at the scientific method, the properties of life, all that fun stuff, the hierarchical organization of biology and so forth. In the last video, we started looking at how atoms can be bonded together to form molecules. And we talked about those different bonds, the covalent bonds, the ionic bonds, and the hydrogen bonds. So now we're going to focus in on the water molecule itself and why it is so important for living things. So by the end of this video, you should be able to describe the properties of water that are critical to maintaining life. So basically, why do we always look for planets that have water on it? Because, that indicates science that there could possibly be life there. So why is water so important? And then we're also going to describe the pH scale and compare its values. Okay, so by the end of this video, we should be finished with Chapter 1. So we're going to start out with an Amoeba Sisters video. So this Amoeba Sisters video will cover, again, that first objective, looking at the, why life is so important, or water is so critical for life, and the characteristics that make water so critical for life.
So we have a riddle for you. Okay, not really a riddle. We're bad at riddles, but more like clues about our favorite molecule. It's polar, it's shaped like an outstretched V, its properties are awesome, and it makes up 3/4 of the surface of the Earth. That one always gives it away. Our favorite molecule is water, and we're not going to lecture you about how important water is and the fact that all life as we know it could not survive without it, because yeah, that's true. But we really want to talk about what makes water so unique for biology itself. What are some awesome properties of water? Now, we mentioned the shape of water and the fact that water is polar. It has one very electronegative oxygen that is always trying to keep the electrons closer to it than to the hydrogens it's bonded to. And this actually gives oxygen a slightly negative charge, because of the electrons that are spending more time next to it, and it gives the hydrogens a slightly positive charge. Well, that means that other water molecules have an easy time bonding together. Why? Well, because the hydrogen of one water molecule with its slightly positive charge can bond to another water molecule's oxygen with that slightly negative charge. These bonds among the water molecules are hydrogen bonds, and these are the very bonds that allow water to have many of the properties that we're about to talk about. Have you ever looked at a really tall tree and wondered, how does the water get all the way up there? I mean, it's got to go against gravity. Gravity? Well, in our plant video, we talk about the xylem. It's vessels within certain types of plants, like trees, and these vessels transport water. But what's really neat about water is that it sticks to the xylem walls in what is known as adhesion, and this helps fight gravity. But water molecules with their hydrogen bonding, they also bond to each other in something called cohesion. It's almost a beads on a string kind of fashion. Water molecules evaporate from a leaf, and then the next water molecule in line is pulled upwards, and so on. This cohesion is really a big deal. Cohesion is also a reason that water striders, one of our favorite insect types, can skate on water. Cohesion contributes to the surface tension of water. Water actually has quite a bit of surface tension compared to many other liquids. And it's not just water striders that can walk on water. There are a lot of insects, spiders, and even larger animals like reptiles and some birds that have the ability to walk on water. So, to the Google for that. Now, with water being polar, it's also a very powerful solvent for other molecules. And that means that water can dissolve many other molecules, especially polar molecules and ionic compounds. Now, why does that matter? Well, this is really important because many of the processes that occur in organisms use water as a solvent. In our body system video, we talk about the function of kidneys, and you definitely couldn't have kidneys doing their function without water. Also, a main component for body fluids is water. I'll never forget when I was little, my father built us a pond. We had some goldfish in there, and I loved this pond. Well, in West Texas, where we're from, it can freeze in the winter. And one morning, I went outside, terrified to find that the top of the pond had frozen. And I thought our fish were goners. Only to find out that they were swimming and doing their dish activities under the ice layer. It's common for many substances to actually contract when they freeze and to become more dense. But water expands when it freezes and becomes less dense in its frozen state, resulting in floating ice, where it can actually make this insulated surface layer that makes a difference for many organisms underneath. And this is due to the hydrogen bonds. See, at freezing level, the making and breaking of hydrogen bonds, which usually happens pretty often, it's not happening very much when frozen. And so the molecules, they're set into this lattice of hydrogen bonded molecules, just far enough apart that it's less dense in ice form than it is in water form. And that's going to be very important for all of that aquatic life. Speaking of temperature, water resists changing its temperature. It has what's called a high specific heat. Specific heat, it's a measurement of heat that's needed to be absorbed or lost for 1 gram of a substance to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. And that's why on the first day that school's out in the summer, it may be super hot outside, but the water could still be pretty cool. It's really good that water's like this for life. It's stabilizing for aquatic environment temperatures. And it also means that water can absorb a lot of heat in the summer without reaching as high of a temperature itself, which is useful when winter comes along, because then the water can release heat as it cools in the winter. This also impacts the environment. Now, still on the topic of temperature, consider evaporation. Many animals rely on evaporation to cool them. Think of water molecules. They are moving, but those that have more heat energy, they're moving the fastest. And they're the more likely molecules to make the phase change to gas. And these molecules, as they leave, their energy, their heat, is no longer on your skin. And by the way, all of this is not just animals too. Plants use evaporative cooling to aid them in hot temperatures. Excessive high temperatures could be very dangerous for many different processes in both plants and animals. It can be damaging to the enzymes involved in those processes. So, that evaporative cooling is very important. Well, we went through a lot of features of water. Definitely something to consider next time you encounter it, which, based on how much we depend on water, will likely be soon. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
So that was a great introduction into the different properties of water and why it's so critically important to maintain life. So we're going to go through those properties in detail so that we have a better understanding. So first off, in the last video we talked about how water forms a polar covalent bond. Okay, so basically we have that oxygen atom forming 2 polar covalent bonds with 2 hydrogen atoms. Okay, so remember, this is due to oxygen having a higher electronegativity than hydrogen. So because of oxygen's higher electronegativity, the electrons are more likely to be orbiting oxygen's nucleus. And so that will lead to this side of the oxygen molecule being partially negative, okay? Whereas hydrogen, because it has a lower electronegativity, the electron will be less likely orbiting the hydrogen, and so there will be a slightly partially positive charge over on this side of the molecule. And so that's why it's considered a polar covalent bond. And so when we're looking at this water molecule, we call it polar. It's a polar molecule. Okay, so water's a polar substance. And when we're dealing with water, other substances that are polar, have that same polarity, if they are, they can interact regularly with water, they're said to be hydrophilic. Okay, so a polar substance, something that has that similar setup where they have polar covalent bonds, they're going to react or interact readily with or dissolve in water. And so those substances are called hydrophilic. Okay. So polar substances that interact readily with or dissolve in water are hydrophilic. So think hydro, water, philic, loving or liking. Okay. Now, nonpolar compounds, they do not want to react with water. And so they're considered hydrophobic. So think phobic, fearing. Okay, so perfect example would be like vegetable oil. If you pour vegetable oil in a jar with water, what happens? Okay, you see a layer forming, right? They separate. You have oil and then you have the water, and they do not mix. Okay, you can shake it up quite a bit. They look like they're kind of mixing together, but then if you set it aside, eventually one goes in one direction, the other goes in the other, and then they're separated. Okay, so that's because oil is formed by nonpolar covalent bonds, and so they're hydrophobic. Okay, so nonpolar covalent bonds are hydrophobic. Polar substances or polar covalent bonds or molecules held together by polar covalent bonds are hydrophilic. Okay. And then the video talked about how water stabilizes temperature. So first of all, what is temperature? Okay. Temperature is a measure of motion of molecules. So basically when molecules are moving really fast, the temperature will increase. When molecules slow down, they're moving slower, the temperature decreases. So we can use this idea to see what happens with water molecules. So at room temperature, water molecules are constantly forming and breaking hydrogen bonds with each other. So remember, hydrogen bonds are those weak interactions that they have between water molecules, the hydrogen of one water molecule and the oxygen of another. So they're constantly breaking and reforming these water molecules. And that's what makes water liquid at room temperature. Okay, so they're constantly breaking and reforming these little weak interactions, these hydrogen bonds. But as the temperature decreases, the water molecules are slowing down, right? And as they're slowing down, they're holding these hydrogen bond interactions longer. And when they hold them longer, they start spreading apart. Okay, so they start spreading apart until they reach this lattice structure. So let me see if I can bring up a little 3D view of it. So let me go ahead and bring that over for you. So you can see how this is a lattice structure. And you can see how there's basically a big gap in between all of these water molecules. Okay, so there's nothing really in between them. And so when ice is forming, when water reaches its solid form, it's going to be, there's air pockets in between. It's less dense than when the water is at room temperature and it's constantly, breaking and reforming and it's in liquid form. Okay, so ice is going to be less dense than liquid water. And this explains why the ice you see here is floating on top of the lake. Okay, so and that's a good thing, as the video talked about how it can actually create like an insulating factor for aquatic life underneath during the winter time. So, you know, imagine there's a big blizzard going on in this environment. You know, the fish, it's pretty stable temperature under the ice. I mean, they're, you know, going to be at a pretty constant temperature under the ice. Nothing's really changing, whereas, you know, it could be well below zero above the ice layer. Okay. We also can notice that on the other side, when these bonds start to move further, when the water molecules start moving further apart, when water is heating up. So imagine that these water molecules are moving faster and faster and faster. Eventually they'll get to the point where they're moving so fast that they're moving away from each other, to the point where they're breaking these hydrogen bonds, and then they're not reforming them anymore. Okay, so they're further and further apart. So that's when we get evaporation. So evaporation occurs when more bonds are broken between the water molecules. These hydrogen bonds are broken more than are reformed. And that's when we have individual water molecules become released and, you know, as water vapor off of the surface of the liquid. Okay, so that's due to the heating up. The molecules are moving really fast. Okay, so when the molecules are slow, the hydrogen bonds stay together longer, becomes less dense. When they're liquid, they're constantly forming and breaking. And then when they're the water molecules are moving fast, they're breaking more often than reforming, and so some of them are released as water vapor. Okay. Another property of water was that we learned about was water is an excellent solvent. So when we're talking about a solution, a solution contains a solvent and a solute. Okay, so a solute is something that gets dissolved, and then a solvent is the dissolving agent. Okay, so solution is solute plus solvent. And usually, you know, water is an excellent solvent. So it's an excellent dissolving agent. And the reason why is because it is capable of dissolving other polar molecules. So remember, a couple slides ago we talked about hydrophilic molecules. So those hydrophilic molecules can be easily dissolved in water. Okay, so they like water. They are attracted to water molecules. So they are more likely to be dissolved in them. Okay, but it's not just polar molecules. It could also be ionic compounds. So ionic compounds can also be easily dissolved in water. Okay, so here's an example of an ionic compound. So remember, ionic bonds form between a cation and an anion. So we have, for example, we have sodium that wants to get rid of its extra electron, and chlorine that wants to gain an extra electron. So they form that ionic bond. So here we have this table salt, the sodium and chlorine have entered the water. And as they enter the water starts to surround the individual atoms, okay? And that chlorine, remember, this is an ion, so it has an extra electron. So because it's, you know, it has a negative charge to it, the hydrogen ends of that oxygen, of that water molecule are going to be attracted to it. So look at all those hydrogens surrounding that chlorine, okay? Over here, the sodium is a cation, so it's positively charged. So the oxygen ends of the water molecule are going to be attracted to that. So now we have a completely dissolved salt. NaCl is no longer NaCl. It's the chlorine is surrounded by water. The sodium is surrounded by water. Okay, so it's completely mixed in. Okay, so water is an excellent dissolving agent or a solvent. Okay. Now, the video also gave us some new terms: cohesion and adhesion and surface tension. Okay, so the video used the example of a tree, and so think about, the tree has leaves, and those leaves are responsible for photosynthesis. And we know that for photosynthesis to take place, plants need carbon dioxide and they need water. Well, they get carbon dioxide from the air, so those, they can get that from little pores in their leaves, but they get water from their roots. So the water has to travel up the tree trunk, through the trunk of the tree, out to the branches, into the leaves. So think about that. It has to go against gravity up that, think about a big tree. Look at, like a giant sequoia or something like that. It has to go way up against gravity, maybe in some cases, 20, 30, 40 feet in the air against gravity, out into a leaf at the tip of a branch. So the way that happens is through these processes of adhesion and cohesion. So adhesion is the attraction between water molecules and other molecules. So water, being polar, is attracted to other, other molecules that can be polar. So so water has a tendency to cling to other things. So it can cling to the sides of these vessels within the tree trunk called xylem. So xylem is it's kind of like a vein or an artery, blood vessel inside you. So think of, water traveling up the tree as like blood traveling up, throughout your body. So in this case, instead of your heart pumping the blood, you actually have water clinging to the sides of the vessel. So that's one way that water can kind of, it clings to the side through adhesion. And then it can also cling to each other. So cohesion is the intermolecular forces between water clinging to each other. So if one water molecule clings to another that adheres to the side of the xylem that clings to another, they can kind of pull upward. Okay, so this creates this water moving against gravity without any heart pumping it or anything like that. Okay, so it's this movement of water through both adhesion, basically adhering to the wall, and cohesion, adhering to each other. Okay. And then the last word we saw in the video, surface tension. So surface tension is just tension at the surface of the body of water that prevents the molecules from separating. So if we remember, those water molecules are constantly breaking and reforming those hydrogen bonds. And that's what, cohesion is all about. So they are, kind of clinging to each other through those hydrogen bonds. And this allows surface tension to take place. Okay, so if, for example, if you take you can try this at home, you take a glass of water and you just take, one of those really thin needles or a pin, and you can just, carefully drop it at the surface of the water. It will float. It'll just sit there. Okay. And it's doing this because it hasn't broken the surface of the water. So basically those hydrogen bonds haven't been broken. Okay, so the water is able to, it's light enough, and the interactions between the water due to cohesion are allowing that pin to stay in place instead of sinking down. Okay. All right. So one thing that the video did not talk about, so we're going to spend the rest of, I guess this video on, is talking about pH. Okay, so pH and buffers and acids and bases. So, you might already be familiar with the pH scale. So you might know that, certain food products are acids, or, might be, like a detergent that you use on clean your clothes as a base. Certain cleaning products could be, an acid or a base. So things like that. But you might not know exactly what that means, okay? An acid is a molecule that donates hydrogen ions. Okay, so that basically means that when you add an acid into a solution, it will actually increase the amount of concentration of hydrogen ions in that solution. So it'll make it more acidic. Now the opposite is for the base. So the base is where it donates hydroxide ions. So a hydroxide ion is basically OH negative. Okay, so this is a hydroxide ion. So oxygen, hydrogen, and then we're adding an extra electron. Right? So in this case, a base added to a solution will add these hydroxide ions. Now if we add hydroxide ions to a solution, that will bind to excess hydrogen ions. So if we're binding to excess hydrogen ions, we're going to make the solution less acidic. We're taking away those hydrogen ions. Okay, so that decreases the hydrogen ions concentration. All right. So adding an acid increases the hydrogen ions concentration, whereas adding a base decreases the hydrogen ions concentration. All right. All right, so let's take a closer look at that pH scale. It's a scale that goes from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral, so that's right in the middle. And then anything less than 7 is considered acidic, and anything greater than 7 is considered basic. So if it's an acidic solution, that means that there is a greater concentration of hydrogen ions to hydroxyl ions. Okay, so if it's less than 7, there will be more hydrogen ions than hydroxyl ions in that solution. If the pH is greater than 7, the opposite. There'll be more hydroxyl ions than hydrogen ions. Okay? And then if it's exactly 7, that's considered neutral, where we have equal amounts of hydrogen ion concentration to hydroxyl ion concentration. Okay? So now that we know, what an acidic solution is versus a basic solution, one thing we need to understand about this pH scale is that it's a logarithmic scale. Okay, so that means that when we go from, say, a pH of 4 to a pH of 6, we're not, decreasing the number of, or the concentration of hydrogen ions by a factor of 2. We're actually decreasing it by a factor of 100, okay? So every time you move up or down the scale by 1, you're actually increasing or decreasing the hydrogen ion concentration by a factor of 10. So it's a base 10 scale here. It's a logarithmic scale. So, if I'm going from tomato juice to black coffee, I'm decreasing the hydrogen ion concentration by 10 times. Okay. If I'm going from tomato juice to lemon juice, I'm increasing the hydrogen ion concentration by 10 times 10 or 100 times. So every time you move one number on the pH scale, you're factoring it by a factor of 10. So it's 10 times 10. So for example, if we go from, let's say, I don't know, let's say we go from lemon juice to black coffee. So, or actually let's do black coffee to lemon juice. So what would be the hydrogen ion concentration? So if I go from black coffee to lemon juice, we have black coffee is going, or actually lemon juice is 10 times 10 times 10. So that's 10 to the third power, which is 1,000 times more hydrogen ions in lemon juice than in black coffee. Okay, or you can say black coffee has 1,000 times less hydrogen ions concentration than lemon juice. Okay, so each time you move one level here, or one, I don't know what you call it, whole number, it's actually a factor of 10. So 10 times 10 times 10. All right. So buffers are an important way that your body has to help maintain homeostasis. So a buffer is a substance that resists a change in pH by either absorbing or releasing hydrogen or hydroxide ions. And remember, hydroxide is that OH negative ion. And the perfect example of this would be your body's buffering of blood pH levels. So this type of buffering system involves carbonic acid. So carbonic acid is H2CO3. So that's this one, H2CO3, which we also, that can actually dissociate into bicarbonate, HCO3 negative, and hydrogen ions. And it can also dissociate into water and carbon dioxide. So let's say that your blood pH range is anywhere from 7.35 to 7.45. So that's where your pH is supposed to be. So it's slightly alkaline. Hydrogen ions circulating in your blood for whatever reason, and that's causing your pH to start to drop, to become more acidic. So the bicarbonate will basically the blood will release that bicarbonate ion, okay, the anion that will bind with the excess hydrogen ions to form that carbonic acid, and then the carbonic acid will then dissociate into water and carbon dioxide, and then you'll exhale that carbon dioxide to get rid of it. Okay, so that will eventually get rid of that excess hydrogen ions, and so that will that will keep the pH in its normal zone. Now let's say the opposite happened. Let's say that we have too much hydroxyl added to the, we have too many hydroxyl ions circulating, and your blood is becoming too alkaline. So if your blood is becoming too alkaline, then we will end up having the, if that's, then the carbonic acid will rapidly dissociate into bicarbonate and the hydrogen ions. Then the hydrogen ions will then bind to the hydroxyl, and you have H plus with the OH negative to form water, and that will limit the increase in pH. Okay, so that carbonic acid is going to be very important in that reaction, because it's basically going to help us either make water or make carbon dioxide, which we can get rid of either way, depending on which direction the pH is going. Okay, so our buffering systems, they don't change the they're not keeping we're not trying to keep the pH neutral in any way. We're just resisting the change in pH. Okay, so sometimes students think that buffers keep it at pH neutral. In this case, it's keeping it at pH 7.35 to 7.45 in this situation because it's blood. It could be like if it's in your stomach and it needs to be pH 2, then the buffer would keep it at pH 2. Or, if it's in a different scenario, it could be pH 4. So buffers keep it at the pH that is, required for that situation. All right? So here's a review question for you. Which of the following statements is not true? Water is polar. Water stabilizes temperature. Water is essential for life. Or water is the most abundant molecule in the Earth's atmosphere. So which one of these is not true? If you said the last one, I would agree with you. So water is polar. Yeah, it's formed by polar covalent bonds. Water stabilizes temperature, okay, because, it has that ability to, we saw the Meet the Sisters video where it can hold on to heat when it gets cold, and then it can release heat when it gets hot. Water is essential for life, so far we've seen that every living thing requires water. But the atmosphere is not made of water, okay? So that would be very thick air to breathe. I mean, water is not the most abundant molecule in the Earth's atmosphere. That would be nitrogen. So nitrogen, N2, is the most abundant molecule in the atmosphere. Can you imagine? It would be impossible to breathe if you're breathing water. Yeah. So next time you're in a swimming pool and you accidentally breathe in water, imagine that's the atmosphere. Okay, so that would be drowning. Okay, we would be drowning if that was true. Okay, so the last one is the one that is not true. Okay, using a pH meter, you find the pH of an unknown solution to be 8.0. How would you describe this solution? Is it weakly acidic, strongly acidic, weakly basic, or strongly basic? If you said weakly basic, I would agree with you. Okay, so remember neutral is 7, and anything above 7 is basic, but it's just barely above 7, so that's why it's considered weakly basic. If it was 11, 12, 13, and then that would be more strong. Okay. And then we have the pH of lemon juice is 2.0, whereas tomatoes juice pH is about 4. Approximately how much of an increase in hydrogen ion concentration is there between tomato juice and lemon juice? Is it 2 times, 10 times, 100 times, or 1,000 times? If you said 100 times, I would agree with you. So remember, every time we go up one whole number, we're increasing by a factor of 10. So 4 to 3, that's 10. 3 to 2, that's 10. So 10 times 10 is 100. All right, so let's take a look at our learning objectives. This is, again, it says chapters 1 and 2. That's for if you have the Campbell book. If you are using the OpenStax book, it's just chapter 1, okay? But you can see both the titles there. Video 1 and 2 covered the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Video 1.4 we got, and 1.5 got into, actually 1.4, when we got into chemistry, you should be able to answer with number 6, define matter and a chemical element, as well as listing the 6 most abundant elements. Number 7, define trace element, give several examples. I also talked about in 1.4 talking about like a compound, which is basically, like an ionic bond type thing where you have equal ratios. So that's number 8. And then number 9, describe how protons, electrons, neutrons combine to form atoms, and then where each are located. We talked about that. And then we talked about the ionic bonds and molecules and covalent bonds. Okay, so that was all covered in the last video, 1.4. And then in this video, I covered how water is a polar molecule. And we already talked about polar versus nonpolar. And we talked about water's polarity leading to hydrogen bonding. We talked about water being the universal solvent. We talked about solution, solvent, and solute, as well as the difference between acids and bases and the pH scale. So we've completed the Unit 1 learning objectives. So that should allow you to complete the review exercise. So this is what you're going to turn in for points. Sorry, this is so big. Okay, so I already told you about exercise 1 and 2, so that covered the first 2 videos. Exercise 3, 4, and 5 covered the last 2 videos. So in this first exercise 3, you're going to label, what is the black dot, what's the red dot with the positive sign, what's the little dot up here. Okay, so which one's the proton, which one's the electrons, which one's the neutron. That's the first part. Then you need to indicate their charges. Okay, so there's 2 parts to this question to get full credit. You need to identify which is which, as well as what are their charges. A lot of times students only indicate what they are, but then they forget what are their charges. Okay, even though one's kind of given to you, you still have to indicate their charge for full credit. Exercise 4 is simply a matching. Okay, so what matches with whom, and you'll notice there's 3 answers but 5 questions, so obviously these will be used more than once. And then for exercise 5, we have our pH. So we practice using the pH scale. So you'll just look up the numbers. You can use the same pH scale that we had in our, let me go back, in our book. Okay, so this came directly from our book, so you can see what the pH is of those items. Okay, and then these are multiple choice questions, so you'll do the calculations to figure out not only what the numbers are, but if it's supposed to be more or less hydrogen. Okay, so that is the assignment, so that actually gets submitted for points. All right, so let's go back. All right, so that is it for 1.5 on water. So by now you should be able to describe the properties of water that are critical to maintaining life, as well as describe the pH scale and compare its values. So this concludes the Introduction to Biology, Chapter 1. In addition to these videos, if you take a look at your OpenStax textbook, there are some extra practice questions. I probably went over some of them already in these videos, but they also have some open-ended questions. So take a look at those and see if you can answer those as extra practice for, preparing for the quiz and the, other stuff. You should be fully prepared now for, since this covers, these videos cover kind of the lecture portion of the class. So, you should be able to easily fill out the worksheet that's due. Next up is going to be a video on the lab. Okay, so the lab that it needs to be completed this week. So look for that one in my YouTube videos.